Well, I know that we only spoke a couple of days ago, but as many of you are aware, things are accelerating. Extraordinary statements are being made, claims, counterclaims, insults are being hurled around. There are leaders in Europe who are freaking out. They're not yet taking action, which they should, but they're absolutely freaking out, especially after the visit of JD Vance and some of the things that have been said. Now, if we pull back, there have been conflicting statements made. The things that really upset people, some of them being rowed back the next day, or things that are absolutely counterintuitive or opposite to those contradictory have been said the next day. So people are feeling scared, they're feeling disoriented, and I thought it would be very useful to get Joe back on the channel, especially as some of the details of the supposed negotiations delegation have been announced. And we don't necessarily have a view on all of them, but there certainly are some characters in there, including one specifically, who we thought we need to call out as being not a great choice at all. But Joe, I'll let you do a little bit of introduction. That's my blurb there. But welcome back.
Hey, Jonathan, good morning, good afternoon here from Kyiv. And yeah, indeed, it's madness. And I see a lot of people obviously are very frustrated and sort of lost in this frenzy. And part of it, the frenzy is in part created by the White House. And you can see that part of that might be design. That is kind of a usual Trump negotiating tactic. But I think for us, the most important thing before we drown in all this ourselves, those who support Ukraine, we really need to realize the information threats that we face. And if we can do that in a calm and serious way, that's our best method out of this. Now, I'll say we really do have a massive information problem. And so there's information that the White House lacks. There's false things that people close to the White House believe. And we need to find a way to articulate that and get louder about it. And I know this from, I used to work at Fox News, and then I worked for a billionaire that funded a lot of Republicans. I'm also part of a club of people that we started years ago that includes some of the leading American conservatives, and we started that group years ago to have a voice. And well, now they do have a voice, and many of the people in the White House. I should know if that group includes Never Trumpers as well, but many of the people in the group are now in power, leading, like Department of Defense and things like that. So I have some insight into that, and I know from conversations recently and over the years with MAGA folks, with Americans, there's a blindness to Ukraine, and as long as that blindness is there, none of our arguments are going to make sense. And I think one example, the blindness should be clear, but one stark example of it, JD Vance, when he was lecturing Europe, almost everything he said about Europe in a way is kind of right. We felt that here in Ukraine. Besides the small nations like Denmark and the Baltics that really have done a lot, punched over their weight to help Ukraine, Germany especially, but France and others have been quite lethargic. They haven't taken this seriously in the way that they are now because they're afraid of losing support from the U.S. And so Europe has been asleep, even though there's been war here for 3 years. And we can see that there are, lots of problems in Europe. But what J.D. Vance totally misses is that you don't have those problems in Ukraine. Ukraine is a society that knows what it believes in, so much so that they will bleed for it. And there's not even any understanding of that. It's almost like he's never, he's never, obviously never seen it, never witnessed it. But like this is, people here are by choice choosing to fight, mothers and fathers, for example, to protect their children, going into war, working as medics, doing everything they can to win because they deeply believe in something. And, a lot of people say if there were a war like this in Berlin, I don't think Berlin would last as long as Kyiv because the people, forget about all the weapons, the people don't know who they are and what they want. Okay, J.D. Vance, I understand your critique of Europe, but that's not a critique of Ukraine. Ukraine actually is the answer for, I think, what Americans and Europeans are seeking. But how do we convey that story? And, we can talk all we want about how, the strong faith of Ukraine and the ethic of the warrior here. But no one is going to listen, Jonathan, unless we correct these blinders that Americans have, including people who are making decisions. And I think the blinders go in these categories. Well, I'll list them quickly, and then we can, discuss them as we need. Firstly, there's a sense that when it comes to the military side, I think even someone like General Kellogg, who will be here soon, Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, they don't know about Ukraine's success because the absence of a problem is very difficult to discuss. And so this winter is Russia's third annual failed winter offensive. We've had power and electricity all winter. We were supposed to be sent back to the Middle Ages, and we're not. This is a huge sign of strength. It's taken a lot of work, a lot of help from the European partners, but a lot of Ukrainian ingenuity. The grid was almost broken by the end of last summer, and yet we have no major electricity problems, and Russians aren't even trying to make that attack. That's a huge success story. The Kursk incursion, an enormous success story. The fact that Pokrovsk, cities in the Donbass have not fallen anywhere near as quickly as predicted. That's a huge success. Kharkiv, I want more and more people to understand Kharkiv. If Donald Trump knew about that place called Kharkiv, 30 miles from Russia, that is a sign that all of this can work. It's also a sign that you can't negotiate because Ukrainians can live in a thriving city 30 miles from Russia. And you're going to give that up? It's one of the strongest, most sort of patriotic places in the country. I even know people from Western Lviv moving to Kharkiv because they want to be there in that spirit of defiance. Kharkiv shows us that, it's a safer, when it's not being attacked, it's a safer city than most American cities. And, so how do we get MAGA folks, how do we get the White House to even hear these stories? And so as long as MAGA sort of believe there's deeply held beliefs that make them anti-Ukraine, if those aren't corrected, we can't break through. And those beliefs are Nuland, Burisma, and the war machine.
And there's other narratives, aren't there? There's, the war was all NATO's fault. The war is a Democrat war. Biden started it, blah, blah, blah. There are lots of narratives that are injected into that media stream, that ecosystem, and they echo around like an echo chamber. And whenever they're questioned, it's seen as partisan. Or we'll come to this in a minute, there are grifters who clearly have figured out that the algorithm will favor them if they tell outright lies, knowingly tell lies. Now, this is the challenge I think we have, isn't it? Is this a problem of bad information or bad intent? Those who are ill-disposed towards Trump, including never-Trumpers, etc., which includes most of Europe, it has to be said, they will immediately take what he says, what comes out of his mouth, as concrete and fact, as a solid intent that will be turned into policy. Whereas you and I know he thinks like a marketer. He's endlessly throwing spaghetti against the wall, seeing what sticks, see what plays with his base. He's creating ideas to see, which direction should we go in. There's no guarantee he will do any of the things he says. And yet, the default assumption, especially amongst Europeans, is that we're looking at someone with bad intent as opposed to bad information. The challenge, if it's bad intent, you can't really do much about that. If it's bad information, this is what you, Stephen Moore, and others, and hopefully myself are doing. We're trying to correct the bad information because that gives us hope. That creates an opportunity and doesn't lead down the path which actually many are falling into at the moment, which is despair.
Exactly. And, there are the bad intents and bad information is the key thing we need to look at with everyone, everyone we're trying to address. And I think ultimately with the decision makers and the top advisors in the Trump administration, it's bad information. I mean, even look at, like Pete Hegseth has said good things about Ukraine in the past. He's just not armed with facts to tell good stories when he's sitting there talking with the president. It's the same with General Kellogg. The bad intent comes from the podcasters and the big influencers who claim to be some kind of reporter. People like, and we can go into detail on it in a moment, but like Jack Posobiec, the very popular guy on X, who amazingly was part of the U.S. Treasury Secretary's delegation to meet Zelenskyy. This guy has bad intent. I'll tell you about that in a second, but I think firstly, on the bad information score, we need to be precise and surgical and saying, why are people willing to believe the worst about Ukraine? Why won't they listen to any good stories about Ukraine? And I keep hitting this because we have to hit it. It's three things. And Elon Musk he continues to tweet this even just a few days ago. They believe that Victoria Nuland created, as representing the U.S., created Ukraine's Maidan. And without that Maidan revolution, that there would be no war. They're right about without Maidan, there would be no war because Ukraine would be part of Russia anyway. But it was not created by Victoria Nuland. And how do we, I need everyone to be focused on dispelling that myth. It's so deeply ingrained that if we dispel it, it will get attention because it's a shock value. But if you take away that myth, a lot of this house of cards of misinformation will crumble. And I met with a member of the Ukrainian parliament a few days ago, right after we spoke last, and she was a protester in Maidan, and she was in the room. I'm going to do an interview with her soon. She was in the room with Vitaly Klitschko and Victoria Nuland. And Nuland, representing the U.S., they didn't like her because she was desperately trying to get the protesters to agree to some kind of compromise with Yanukovych, the pro-Russian president. That's how the CIA, State Department, that's how they like to manage global affairs. It's like goes back to George W.H.W.'s chicken keep speech. Keep your freedom in check, and that's what they were saying to the protesters. And the people of Ukraine said no. They rejected Nuland's proposal, and Yanukovych fled. And if we could get people to understand that, she did not create it. And unfortunately, I wish she would start speaking about this, but I think, it's very flattering to the ego to be told that you are the creator of a revolution. So we got to fix this problem because it is cornerstone. I know people don't want to believe it, but if you listen to Joe Rogan or any of these podcasts, or now if you listen to people in the White House, they believe that. And if we don't correct it, it's a major problem. That's the first
And the
thing.
alternative story is not flattering to her. The idea that you went for stasis, stability, status quo, that you're willing to side with, a would-be authoritarian to actually quell democracy and freedom, which in this case is the truth, because that has been US policy really since the 90s, to try and prevent a collapse of Russia, to prevent, satellite territories like Ukraine from ceding away from the Soviet Union in the first instance, and put a lid on all these dangerous forces of freedom and change. That's the real story. And if Trump and his administration want to be seen as revolutionaries, then actually siding with Ukraine is the better story. But how do you inject this in? Because it seems that, people talk about the court at Mar-a-Lago, and actually, they mean that in that they're implying Trump is behaving like a king. But actually, there's another aspect of a court, which is that you have a very small circle of people where information recycles, like in a closed room with air conditioning, right? That is the bigger problem here, because it seems that Trump interacts with a very fixed, finite set of people, and they are repeating these stories, and he's listening to them. How do we inject other narratives into that?
This is the most difficult thing. And if you think back to one of the biggest information successes for Ukraine was in May 2024. Remember, it was hard to communicate things to Biden, like send weapons now, we're not going to get nuked. And there was a unified chorus, so perfectly unified out of necessity, when the Russians were on the edge of destroying Kharkiv. And it was give Ukraine limited permission to protect Kharkiv. And it was so precise from top to bottom in the Ukraine movement that it worked. The White House had to agree. We need to have that type of precision once again. But here's why it's so difficult. So, for example, this guy, Jack Posobiec, who I mentioned, he very popular right-wing commentator, and he has spread a lot of poison about Ukraine. And he was part of the official delegation to Europe with Pete Hegseth, because they're buddies, and with the U.S. Treasury Secretary to Kyiv. In fact, we were doing another interview a few days ago, and our translator had to race away to be a translator between Zelenskyy and the U.S. delegation. But later I found out that Posobiec was there, and he should never have been allowed in Ukraine, and he is such a poison. And I think that we can separate him from the White House if we show what a grifter he's been. And I remember back in 2022, someone who's now a very high-ranking Trump foreign policy official, she believes in Ukraine. She's quiet about it, but she believes in it. She doesn't lie about Ukraine. And she asked if I would help show Posobiec the truth. And so we secretly brought him to Ukraine in 2022. we took him to Lviv because Posobiec bills himself as a super Catholic. Lviv is one of the most Catholic cities that you can ever find. The churches are teeming and overcrowded, not just on Sundays. And and he went to Mykolaiv. He saw a lot of the stuff, and he leaves, and he got quiet for about 6 months. He stopped attacking Ukraine. So that was maybe the best thing we achieved. We shut him up. But then he started again, and in the most ridiculous ways. He was one of the initial offenders in the very beginning when the Ukrainians were training people who had never been soldiers before, and they were using wooden guns and paintball guns to train. And Posobiec shared this to fuel this idea that the war was fake, that it was a Biden theater, and never corrected that. In fact, when I was sitting with Posobiec in the cafe in Lviv, I said I couldn't remember who had shared that original post, and I mentioned it to him, and he's like, "Oh man, that's terrible." And the next day I found out it was him, and he never corrected it. And then one last example, I think the worst thing he did, but how difficult it is to get the truth out. There was 2 summers ago, there were 3 top films in America with Barbie and Oppenheimer, and the third movie is called The Sound of Freedom. And at first I thought, oh, maybe that'll be about Ukraine. That would be appropriate. But it was about the child sex trafficking in Colombia. And it was supposedly the real life story of this guy, Tim Ballard. Tim promoted the show very heavily on podcasts like Jack Posobiec. And one way they promoted it was by bashing Ukraine. Tim Ballard, who later has been shown to be a bit questionable in his activities, he came to Lviv for 1 week. I know it because I was there. I know the people that were close to him. He never left Lviv, and he goes on Posobiec's show, and he's like, I was in Ukraine, and it was so scary. He bills himself as a tough guy. And then he says in a clip that Posobiec's team used, they pushed it far and wide. He said that Tim Ballard said when he was in Ukraine, he discovered a pedophile political party that they have here. Total lie, total absurd. No backing it up whatsoever. It was actually a party from the Netherlands that he was referencing. And then he talked about the sex trafficking and the kidnapping of children, but never mentioned Russia, which there is kidnapping happening here, but it's happening in occupied zones. And this was complete lies, just meant to besmirch Ukraine and to fit into that Russian narrative that Ukraine is this evil biolaboratory of of horrible things, and it's quite the opposite. This is the Europe that fights for its values, where kids are safe to walk to school on their own when there's no missile attacks. And when I posted a correction on Twitter to that, I had very powerful people who are now employees of the White House contact me personally and say, Joe, don't do that. Don't go after. They don't really care about Jack, but don't go after Tim Ballard. He's such a good guy. I said, if he's such a good guy and he really cares about kidnapped kids, why is he lying? Why won't he say the perpetrator? Why won't he say that Russia is the perpetrator here? And all these people basically told me to shut up. Several of them have stopped talking to me because I called them out on that. And because I'm alone in this, really on that score, because a lot of the pro-Ukraine people, they're not connected at all to the MAGA world in any way, and so they think any engagement is something evil, and so no one is correcting these things. Everyone's ignoring it. There's a whole world of people who listen to Joe Rogan. We should pay attention to that because that's what influences things now, and we're not. We're on the sidelines, and I think Ukraine feels sort of drowning in this and sort of almost helpless when it comes to information. I mean, here we are. I was doing great interviews with people all week, but Jack Posobiec, flies in and meets with Zelenskyy, and Zelensky's not prepared. Well, he doesn't know what a grifter this guy is. He doesn't know the three things that we have to be hitting. Nuland did not create the revolution. She tried to stop it. Burisma is not Ukrainian, it's Russian. And the war machine has an incentive for this war to go on forever and not for Ukraine to have a quick victory. Those are the 3 fundamental things. And we have to actually respect, we can laugh about the fact that people believe that stuff, but we have to I understand why Americans believe these things because they're sick of foreign wars. They're sick of the government sort of, pressuring them. Okay, I respect that completely. And the U.S. has caused a lot of problems in foreign policy. We're doing it once again because we're not actually getting to the roots of it. And so that's what we really have to we need pro-Ukrainian people to be very disciplined and sharp in sharing these messages, because it's very hard to punch through, when you have such powerful grifters like the Soviet.
And that's one of the challenges, isn't it? Because if one starts to correct that information but uses it in an aggressive way, if one uses it to also bash other aspects of Trump's domestic policies, if one brings up 6th of January, which is highly problematic, especially when you have someone like Vance coming and lecturing Europe, and yet, well, we won't go into that because it's an alienating thing, but people know exactly what I'm referring to there. There's a degree of, this is an interesting message from Vance, but coming from this guy, I don't think so. But that's, when within the MAGA circle they hear that and that kind of wrapping of the message, not only is it instantly rejected, but they probably think, haha, our stories are working because look, they've got the opposition all riled up. We'll carry on doing this because this is working in our own partisan domestic struggles. So actually, we not only do we not get good information injected into the ecosystem, we might actually accelerate the bad information through the very sort of tone and mode of our communication.
I agree, Jonathan. And it's if we want people to support Ukraine, and we know that they would if they got through all the blinders. This is the faith, family, freedom, and they'll fight for it. But we can't make it seem that supporting Ukraine becomes a wholesale rejection of everything else they believe in. So, for example, with Doge, like, okay, I know the Pentagon's a disaster, and it needs to be cleaned up. We know this. So I can say I support a lot of what's happening with Doge. I support it totally. And sorry, make sure my microphone's okay. I support it completely. But if I start saying, if you want to support Ukraine, then you all of a sudden have to oppose everything that Trump stands for, good luck, because that's not going to work. And it doesn't make any sense. Actually, there are lots of points of synchronicity. And this is what really bothers me, but why we have a chance. Like everything J.D. Vance said in his speech, he's pretty right about Europe. Europe is lost in so many ways, with some exceptions. But you come to Ukraine and you see the people who are not lost, and they include Europeans, they include Americans who see what's at stake, and they'll fight for it. And this is what we have to shift. It's someone like J.D. Vance. He is open to engagement. I've seen, for example, I have a friend who, fellow alumnus of my university. He's got maybe like 2,000 followers on X, and he posted something that JD said about Catholicism, like a high-level theological discussion. And JD Vance last week engaged him on X in a high-level theological exchange. So the engagement is possible, and I believe it. And I think that there's like with JD Vance, he's intellectual, but we have to get to these core things that they believe that are false, and show them the light on it. I think that's the only way. But make sure that it's focused on Ukraine, but finding the only way you can really communicate with people in a good way. Find some points of agreement, and then say, okay, I understand your frustrations, and let's work together. And if you look at Ukraine's Maidan, is so much of what Americans on the left and the right have been wanting to do. I mean, look at I saw a video of Jon Stewart and Bernie Sanders saying they agree with RFK that the food that we eat is garbage. Yes, we all kind of agree on a lot of these things. And the more we can focus on that, we can get ourselves away from sort of the fringe things that we run into in our silos. So that's what we need to do. Yeah.
The other challenge we've got, isn't it? And we'll come on to some of the other problematic things Vance has hinted at. And again, we won't take those as being actual concrete policy yet, but we'll come to why they are deeply problematic. But let's continue with that, because Europe does have a plethora of issues. There's no question. Britain has multiple issues as well, but also the positivity. The fact that there are still strong family values across Europe. The statistics sort of bear that out. But there are, innumerable issues, assimilating, large numbers of immigrants into society. And there are huge, huge issues. There's no question there. But the pivot that people don't understand, and you and I are like, well, look at Ukraine. Ukraine has a solution for many of these problems. Ukraine is experimenting more, trying to, tackle these problems and pull itself out of the Soviet mindset. And in that way, it not only has some of the solutions now, it has some of the future solutions which it hasn't yet come across, but is on a process of being far more flexible. But the pivot we don't understand is why people look to Russia as a place that has these solutions. And that seems to be a sort of natural pivot, not just for many of the grifters, but for many of those who have poor information. And we know that Russia has the highest abortion rates. It has the lowest rates of families staying together, divorce rates. It has the highest rates of domestic abuse. You go outside the main capitals, and it's not all sort of shiny metros, as Tucker Carlson was saying, but it's really a dire, impoverished existence, characterized, I would say, by a total lack of freedom, responsibility, and the rates of corruption are beyond anything I think anyone in the West can imagine, and it's extreme punitive justice sort of society as well. Why on earth do people pivot to seeing that as an area of solution?
It goes back to, again, it's these three deeply held beliefs that have turned Americans against Ukraine, and no matter what we argue, no matter what we say about what a wonderful society, how low crime Ukrainian cities are, how many people go to church. I mean, the stats from 2019 show that more people go to Orthodox Church in smaller Ukraine than in all of Russia. Sovietism destroyed all of that, and that's something we should talk about. That I think Vance and others would appreciate. But like the effects of the Bolshevik Revolution were so vile and terrible that they have destroyed religion in Russia. And as we see, they make them into monsters. But Jonathan, as long as we fail to address those three underlying things, we can talk all we want, and they're just not going to believe us. They're going to say you're a propagandist. You're blind for this, and you're pushing for this war that we don't need. They're not going to, like, nothing else matters unless we hit the points. Nuland, Burisma, war machine. If we don't address the, I mean, it might sound ridiculous, but follow Elon's tweets. See the pattern of thinking. This is, and if we could get someone like Hegseth, for example, or Kellogg, but I think especially Hegseth, who already was supporting Ukraine, if he could be armed with this information and say this in conversations to Trump and Elon and others, say, wait a second, that the Nuland thing is bullshit. That the Burisma thing is actually Russian corruption. Then there's a chance. That's how we have to think. But as long, I know it for a complete fact, as long as we don't address those three things, we can talk about anything else, and it's not going to matter. There's no argument we're going to make, because we have to get to the underlying deep-seated belief that makes them say, we've heard, because it's like almost like they're saying, we heard George W. talk about Iraq, all that. We believed it. We went to the football games and chanted USA, and we feel like we were fools. We're not doing it again. And that's what happens when we even tell them how terrible Russia is. They're like, yeah, not this time, guys. Let's correct the deep underlying assumptions, which are easily correctable if we just take it head on. Nuland, Burisma, war machine, fix those.
And of course, things are accelerating at a dizzying pace. That's why some people are extremely disoriented, even though I think a lot of what's happening now is things that have been talking about on the channel for the last 2-3 years of where this might logically lead if the evil of Russia is not tackled soon, and is rather appeased, or soft appeasement, which is soft appeasement in my mind is the need to try and maintain some kind of stability and balance, and not let it collapse, etc., not tackle the issue or let Ukraine win. That is absolutely soft appeasement, and Biden's policy has led plus the policies of previous administrations led to where we are now. The challenge is you've got Vance and others who are busy throwing ideas out there. They may not necessarily follow up on those ideas, but those ideas themselves are being tracked by Vladimir Putin, and they may be giving him ideas. One in particular that came up yesterday, which I think both Hegseth and Trump have mentioned, is the idea that the US will have a major pullout of troops from Europe. Now, I can see why they may say that. One, there's the whole cost saving, and the US needs to pivot to Asia. There's maybe a strategy there to sort of force Europe to pay for its own defense. Well, that's all well and good. The trouble is, history shows us that those kind of statements lead to terrible things. When Britain withdrew two of its sort of destroyers or Royal Navy boats from the Falklands through pure cost-saving exercise, guess what happened? It sent a signal to Argentina that we no longer cared and that they could invade. This is my immediate response here. Putin will look at this and go, okay, if the US physically withdraws for Europe, no matter what the reason is, he will see this as a perfect way to start challenging Article 5, possibly invading territory, possibly taking the Baltics. None of these are complete outliers. These are very, very real possibilities, no matter what we think about European strength and whether our air power could wipe out the Russians or not. The fact is, no one knows. No one knows whether German youth would stand up and defend their country or just let Russia roll over it. We can be fairly assured that Hungary, probably Slovakia, Serbia, would allow that to happen without a fight. So I think the things that are being said are queuing up an extremely dangerous situation.
Yeah, and for sure. But I think Europe. What was it going to take to wake Europe up? War in Ukraine was not. Russia's war was not enough to wake Germany up. Really, it's appalling how lethargic most European countries have been. And Macron, tough talking. Okay, he finally sent the Mirage jets, which we heard over Kyiv in air defense. Thank God, a few days ago during that horrible attack. But Europe has been late. I mean, they've not been producing the weapons and munitions they need to. They need a wake up call. So, from that perspective, I can't fault the White House on this. What is it going to take to scare Europe into action? That's fair, fine. It's a little bit late, but we're still alive, so let's try it. That's the first thing. It's Europe that needs to wake up for sure. Secondly, I hope that beyond the rhetoric, the White House will see the cost. I mean, if you pull all these things out, you're going to have to rebuild it again. Right now, we could do it so easily if you really partnered with Ukraine on making our military stronger. And I see this with all the communications from the White House leadership, Elon again, about the Pentagon. What a bloated waste, all the bloated waste of the Pentagon. Ukraine has the answers, specifically on drone technology, but even like with the Patriot missiles, Ukrainians have MacGyvered them and made them more effective. Here are the answers. And what we're going to do is we're just going to miss it. All the effort and years that went into this, miss it and try to redo this on our own is stupid. It's not efficient government. It's inefficient government to do this. And so we need to actually re-understand our idea of government efficiency. It's making sure that we don't create bigger problems down the road. That's a very important part of efficiency. And maybe that means you don't strip everything away now, because you're going to have to fix it and rebuild it. That's a key thing to make. But again, all of this argument, people will tune it out unless we get to the heart. I really want to urge people to help me on this quest to really get to the heart of this and say, you've been lied to about Ukraine. That's it. Americans like that. We like being told we've been lied to, because it's like then we find Jesus. We see the light. This is our national mentality in many ways. I was blind and now I see. And this is why, this is why we kind of like conspiracy theories, because there are a lot of conspiracies, powerful people trying to control our lives. And guess what? Ukrainians don't like that either. That's why they had the Maidan Revolution. And There's no understanding of that whatsoever. We had this top podcaster here this week in Ukraine, someone close to Elon, and he didn't have any idea what Maidan was, and didn't even want to understand it. How do you deal with that? And I think that, what you can do is say, let me tell you 3 shocking things. Again, I'll repeat it one more time because I want people to understand it. Burisma is not Ukrainian, it's Russian, pro-Russian corruption money. Victoria Nuland tried to stop the revolution, not create it. And the war machine does not want a quick victory for Ukraine. They want a long, forever war that makes Europe scared and makes Europe buy more weapons. Those are the 3 things we need to get people to understand. And then say, Ukrainians, everything that J.D. Vance is crying for in his very, well put together speech, will say, okay, about principles and values, it's here in Ukraine and people are fighting and bleeding for it. That's it. And you can sit there and lecture, but you're missing the people who are not freedom talking, but freedom fighting. That's it. And I think if we together, let's try to punch through on these things, correct these myths, and get them to say, you're missing the real story. That's it. I don't know how, without that, nothing's going to work.
There's another narrative, and I think those are all essential. Those are absolutely foundational pieces to tackle those narratives. Once, or in parallel to that, we can take the technological argument, because one of the things you mentioned, the Pentagon a couple of times, the huge bloated bureaucracy, the slowness with which everything happens, the obstruction, and the waste inherent in that process. And I think everyone understands that. And certainly that is a topic which really, will get people going, those who are on the more conservative side. What Ukraine is doing is innovating technology at the speed of Silicon Valley. It is testing these weapons. It is going through multiple generations of weaponry every single month. Whereas, Western procurement processes might take 3, 6, 9, 12, 18 months to actually get equipment through. It's redundant. They're working on taking the unit cost out of the system while scaling up and innovating at the same time. So this is an extraordinary thing that's going on. This also may be an argument where we can attract, let's say, Musk's attention, because he's not going to be interested in Maidan. He's not going to be interested in any of this stuff. But this super on steroids technical innovation process, that could get his attention, because 1, it's ticking the box politically, solving many of the US's problems. 2, there's profit, there's money to be made from learning those skills.
Yeah, for example, we have coming up here soon in Kyiv, the Brave One conference, which is really a phenomenal gathering of innovators, large and small, developing military technology, and it's inspiring. And if Musk saw that, he would say, this is what we need to be learning from. 100%. But still, I have to say, Musk is not, he's interested in Maidan. He actually is, Jonathan. He talks about it all the time. At least twice a week, he's talking about Maidan and how it was created by the CIA. So he is interested, very interested. But none of us have been interested in fixing this and correcting it. He's more interested in that than in hearing about Ukrainian drones, because it's such a powerful belief, because they are so sick. Americans are sick of whatever you want to call it, the deep state. RFK, for example, there's a reason why he's part of this. Not just to make America healthy. He comes from this place of American trauma. JFK and RFK assassinated. And Americans don't trust, especially from that moment, that broke so much trust with the government. It's trauma. And Americans, they're sick of it. And they suspect. And as they go through all the line items and they see how money's been spent, and they look at how Washington is the wealthiest part of America, they're really sick of this. And we have to understand that. And yes, Elon is very interested in Maidan, but in the wrong way. And he's more interested in that than almost anything else when it comes to Ukraine. So we have to correct it head on. That's it. This is my only point I can say, Jonathan, is if we don't correct those 3 things, we don't have a chance of changing hearts and minds on Ukraine.
And we don't have a chance of taking some of these really very bad characters, at least one that we know about, that's been sent on the delegation to negotiate the future of Ukraine. course, we know that Ukraine does not have to accept a bad deal. There are consequences to turning that down. There are consequences to turning down the the minerals contract that was shoved under Zelensky's nose. There are consequences to Ukraine retaining its agency and freedom. But we can do our bit by tackling these narratives and trying to get some really poor choices of negotiators changed before it's too late. Joe, last word from you, and then that's probably all we've got time for.
If we can make these points very clearly, we will take away the power of the grifters like Posobiec. We will show that they have false information and that they're liars and they're not to be trusted. And then, we have to start with the first step, dealing with the foundation of the false beliefs. And we have to do it with a unified voice so that we actually can be heard. And then we start to take apart the house of cards. And that is our urgent priority. I'm trying to get Ukrainians to understand it. And we need pro-Ukraine people around the world, people who listen to this channel, to work. If we can work together on this, addressing these 3 points, then we can get rid of that and we can get to the real stuff we need to talk about what Ukraine needs to win, what we can learn from Ukraine. But first, let's start with these 3 points. Nuland, Burisma, War Machine, dispel the myths.
Joe, thank you. Thank you for everything you do there, and fingers crossed we cut through.
We will, man. You're a key part of it. Thank you.